The Mermaid's Alchemist. Act 1. The Meridian's rail bit into Blanc's palms like a warning. He did not look down. The northern waters had grown strange, colder than they should have been for late autumn, their surface broken by currents that moved against the wind. The ship creaked beneath him, a living thing protesting the unnatural stillness of the sea. In his pocket, the paper crackled. His master's final commission, a formula for extracting essence from living matter, written in ink that smelled of iron and old books. He had spent 32 years learning precision, the alchemy of heat and discipline, the belief that all transformation could be controlled if one measured carefully enough. The fog came at dusk. It did not roll. It rose, tendrils of phosphorescence unspooling from the water like fingers testing the air. The crew had already fled below decks, their footsteps a frantic rhythm against the wood, but Blanc remained. He leaned forward, the rail pressing into his ribs, and watched as the light gathered itself into shapes that were almost faces, almost hands. The cold bit deeper, not the clean sting of winter, but something older, something that tasted of copper and salt, and the slow decay of things left too long in the dark. This is not drowning, he thought. This is understanding. The first mermaid broke the surface without a sound. She did not rise so much as emerge, her skin catching the last of the daylight and holding it like a secret. Her hair was the color of wet kelp, her eyes black and depthless, reflecting nothing. She did not speak. It wasn't necessary for her. Something moved in the space between them, an intention, a demand. And Blanc felt it settle into his bones like a weight he had always carried. You will come. You will work. You will perfect what your master began. He did not resist as the others surfaced around him, their bodies forming a circle that tightened with each passing second. The fog thickened, clinging to his skin, and the last of the daylight bled into the water. The Meridian groaned, its hull straining against the sudden pressure of the sea, but Blanc barely heard it. His breath came shallow, the air too thin, too heavy, as if the atmosphere itself had been replaced by something denser, something that wanted to fill his lungs. The mermaid closest to him reached out. Her fingers were webbed, her nails sharp as fishbones, but her touch was gentle. She pressed her palm to his chest, just over his heart, and the world tilted. Precision, he thought, even as the water closed over his head. Control. The last thing he saw was the phosphorescence, swirling around him like a promise. The last thing he tasted was salt. The last thing he knew was that he would never leave. The water trembled against the stone. Blanc's lungs burned before his eyes opened, salt and copper flooding his throat. His chest locked in a spasm that refused to break. He convulsed, fingers clawing at nothing, and then the world snapped into focus. A dome of air trapped beneath living rock, the walls slick with condensation that ran in slow rivulets toward the dark water below. His body remembered drowning before his mind did. A figure loomed above him, scales catching the dim phosphorescence like shattered glass. Thessaly. Her presence pressed against his consciousness, not with sound, but with the weight of something vast and ancient, something that had watched empires rise and fall without blinking. Perfect, the Pearl Consommé, her voice echoed inside his skull, though her lips did not move. Or watch your memories dissolve into the sea. Blanc's fingers curled into the stone, the ridges biting into his palms. The air was thick, stale, laced with the mineral tang of coral and the faintest hint of something burning. Copper, maybe, or the ghost of a flame. His master's final commission. The formula, folded into his coat pocket, was still there, still dry. He had not drowned. Not yet. He swallowed, tasting iron. The lie formed before he could stop it. Mercy, not power. The words settled in his chest, heavy as a stone. He had spent his life believing that precision could redeem any purpose, that knowledge was control. Here, in this sealed chamber, he began to understand the cost of that belief. Yes, he said, and the word tasted like surrender. Thessaly's smile did not reach her eyes. She extended a hand, and in her palm lay a single pearl, luminous as a captured moon. Begin. The stone beneath Blanc's knees was cold, unforgiving. He took the pearl, its surface smooth and unyielding, and turned it over in his fingers. The weight of it was wrong. Too light, too perfect. It hummed against his skin, a vibration just beyond hearing, like the echo of a voice he could not quite remember. The chamber stretched around him, a cavern carved from living rock, its walls pulsing faintly with bioluminescence. At its center stood a copper pot, wide and shallow, its surface darkened by years of use. A brazier sat beside it, its coals black and lifeless. The fire, when it came, would be his responsibility, his salvation, his doom. Blanc exhaled, his breath fogging the air. The deception twisted deeper within his ribs. Mercy, not power. He repeated it like an incantation, like a prayer. The alternative, dissolution, the slow unraveling of his mind into the sea, was unthinkable. The man practiced the ancient art of transmutation. He would perfect the consommé. He would survive. He rose, his legs unsteady, and crossed to the brazier. The coals were cold, but the air above them shimmered with residual heat. He knelt, cupping his hands around the copper pot, and felt the faintest warmth radiating from its surface. It was not enough, not nearly enough. Thessaly watched from the shadows, her presence a pressure against his back. She did not speak. Such action remained beyond her requirements. Her silence was a command, a reminder of the choice she had given him. Perfect the consommé. Or dissolve. Blanc's fingers trembled as he reached for the tinderbox. The wood inside was damp, resistant. He struck the flint again and again, sparks skittering across the coals before dying. His breath came faster, the air in the chamber growing thinner with every failed attempt. The lye tasted sharper now, like salt on a wound. Then a spark caught. A single flame flickered to life, weak and unsteady, but alive. Blanc leaned closer, shielding it with his body, and fed it slivers of wood. The fire grew, hesitant at first, then stronger, its warmth licking at his face. He exhaled, his shoulders loosening fractionally. The flame was his now, his responsibility. He turned to the copper pot, setting it carefully over the fire. The metal hissed as it met the heat, the sound sharp in the quiet of the chamber. Blanc reached into his pocket and withdrew the formula, unfolding it with deliberate care. The ink was smudged in places, the handwriting familiar, his master's, precise and unyielding. The Pearl Consommé. A broth that could distill memory into something tangible, something consumable, a tool, a weapon. His fingers brushed the pearl in his palm, its surface cool and smooth. He dropped it into the pot, and the water inside shivered, rippling outward in slow, lazy circles. The pearl sank, its glow dimming as it settled against the copper. Thessaly's voice slithered into his mind again, a whisper without sound. Begin. Blanc reached for the vial of salt water at his feet, its contents murky with sediment. He poured it into the pot, the liquid hissing as it met the heat. The scent of brine filled the chamber, sharp and acrid, mingling with the copper tang of the pot. His stomach twisted, but he ignored it. He was an alchemist. He would not falter. He added a pinch of crushed coral, its fragments glittering like shattered bone. The water darkened, turning the color of old blood. Blanc stirred it with a wooden spoon, the motion slow and deliberate. The lye coiled tighter in his chest. Mercy, not power. He repeated it like a mantra, like a shield. The fire crackled beneath the pot, its heat seeping into his skin. Blanc leaned closer, his breath fogging the air above the broth. The pearl had dissolved, its essence swirling through the liquid in lazy spirals. The scent of it was wrong, too sweet, too cloying, like rotting flowers. His fingers tightened around the spoon. Thessaly moved closer, her scales catching the firelight. She did not speak, but her presence pressed against him, a weight he could not shake. This is your purpose now, her silence said. This is your salvation. Blanc's jaw ached from clenching. He added a drop of something dark and viscous from a vial at his belt, his master's final instructions scrawled in the margins of the formula. Memory is the catalyst. The broth hissed, bubbling violently, and the scent of it changed. Sharper now, like burning hair, like something alive and suffering. His hands stilled. The lye tasted like ash in his mouth. The broth darkened further, turning the color of storm clouds. Blanc's reflection stared back at him from the surface, distorted and flickering. He looked older, hollow. Thessaly's voice echoed in his mind, softer now, almost gentle. You are doing what must be done. Blanc's fingers trembled as he reached for the ladle. The broth was ready. It had to be. He dipped the ladle into the pot, the liquid thick and sluggish, and lifted it to his lips. The scent of it was overwhelming. Copper and salt, and something deeper, something that clawed at the edges of his memory. Céleste. Her face flickered in his mind, her voice whispering from the broth itself. You left me behind. Blanc's breath caught. The lie unraveled in his chest, the threads of it snapping one by one. Mercy, not power. The words were hollow now, meaningless. He had told himself this was necessary. He had believed it. The broth touched his lips, its heat searing. He drank. The taste was unbearable. Salt and iron, and something darker. Something that coiled in his stomach like a living thing. His vision swam, the chamber tilting around him. Thessaly's face loomed above him, her eyes black and endless. You are doing what must be done, she repeated. And this time, the words were not a comfort. They were a condemnation. Blanc's knees hit the stone. The lie was gone now, burned away by the broth in his veins. He understood too late what he had agreed to, what he had become. The fire burned on, captive and hungry. Silence gripped the room completely, and Blanc, for the first time, truly saw the cost of his salvation. The mortar struck the pestle with a sound like breaking glass. Blanc's fingers tightened around the handle, knuckles whitening beneath the pressure. The bioluminescent algae resisted at first, tiny, stubborn things, their glow pulsing faintly in the dim light of the sealed chamber. He ground harder, circling the pestle in slow, deliberate strokes. The algae fractured, releasing a scent like ozone and salt, sharp enough to make his eyes water. The pigment bled into the bowl, a sickly green that reminded him of the phosphorescence in Céleste's studio, the way her hands had looked when she mixed her paints by candlelight. He set the mortar down with care, as if it might shatter if handled too roughly. The copper pot sat on the workbench, its surface dull in the chamber's perpetual twilight. He had spent the last 3 days arranging the tools, scalpels, vials, a set of brass weights he had salvaged from the wreckage of the Meridian. Each item had its place, each movement its purpose. Precision was the only thing keeping him from drowning in the weight of what he was about to do. The chamber walls were lined with pearls now, strung in careful rows like vertebrae. He had taken them from the storage vaults beneath Thessaly's throne, where they lay in heaps, harvested from mermaids whose names no one remembered. Each pearl was a memory, a fragment of a life distilled into something small and hard and beautiful. He had threaded them himself, his fingers trembling only once, when he realized he could no longer recall the exact shade of Céleste's eyes. A sketchbook lay open on the bench, its pages filled with attempts to capture her face. The lines were uneven, the proportions wrong. He had drawn her a dozen times, and each version was less accurate than the last. The memory of her was slipping, eroding at the edges like ink in water. He traced the latest sketch with a fingertip, feeling the paper's grain against his skin. The mortar beside him had been hers. He recognized the chip in the rim, the way the handle fit just so in the palm. He had taken it from her studio the night he left Lion, tucked it into his coat like a thief. Ce n'est pas de l'alchimie, c'est du vol. The words slipped out unbidden, a whisper in the language of his childhood. He did not look up to see if Iris had heard. She stood near the chamber's entrance, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the rows of pearls. She had been watching him for days, her silence heavy with judgment. He could feel it pressing against his skin, a current of disapproval that made the air between them thick. He reached for the vial of distilled water, measuring it drop by drop into the copper pot. The fire beneath it burned low, fed by dried kelp and the last of the air trapped in the chamber's dome. He tended it carefully, adjusting the flow of oxygen with a series of valves he had rigged from salvaged pipes. The flames were his responsibility now, his to control, his to keep alive. If they died, so did he. The algae pigment swirled into the water, turning it a murky green. He stirred it with a glass rod, watching the color deepen. The pot had been his master's, a relic from the days when alchemy was still an art and not a transaction. He had carried it with him from Lion, wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into the bottom of his trunk. It had survived the wreck of the Meridian, survived the descent into the abyss, survived the slow unraveling of his life. He set the rod down and wiped his hands on his apron. The fabric was stiff with salt, the pockets heavy with vials and scraps of paper. He had begun to document everything, the measurements, the temperatures, the way the pearls reacted when ground into powder. Thessaly had given him no instructions beyond perfect consommé, but he knew what she wanted. She wanted to drink the past like wine, to taste the memories of her enemies and her lovers and her forgotten dead. She wanted to consume them whole, and he was the one who would give it to her. Iris shifted beside him, her tail flicking against the stone floor. The sound was soft, almost imperceptible, but he heard it. He always heard it. She had been assigned to assist him, though he suspected she was here to watch him as much as to learn. Thessaly did not trust easily, and she trusted him least of all. "You're using too much pigment," she said. Her voice was low, measured. She did not look at him as she spoke, her gaze fixed on the pot. He did not answer. The words were unnecessary. She knew as well as he did that the measurements were precise, that the pigment was exactly what the recipe required. But she was testing him, probing for weakness. His hand moved toward the pestle vessel once more, fingertips grazing its damaged edge. The memory of Céleste's hands on it was fading, replaced by the ghost of his own. He crushed the final seaweed remnants into fine dust, its harsh scraping cutting through the stillness. Iris exhaled, a slow release of breath that carried the weight of her disapproval. "You're shaking." He stilled his hands. The tremor was there, a fine vibration in his fingers, a betrayal of the control he had worked so hard to maintain. He clenched his fists, willing the movement to stop. "It's the cold," he said. It wasn't the cold. She did not press the issue. Instead, she stepped closer, her tail coiling around the base of the workbench. The movement was deliberate, a reminder of her presence, of her power. She was Thessaly's creature, just as he was, but she had not yet been broken by the weight of what they were doing. He envied her that. The fire beneath the pot flared, its light casting long shadows across the chamber walls. The pearls gleamed in the flickering glow, their surfaces smooth and unblemished. He had arranged them himself, each one a silent witness to the theft he was committing. He wondered if they could feel it, the slow erosion of their essence, the way their memories were being ground into something new, something that no longer belonged to them. He reached for the vial of distilled water again, his fingers steady this time. The tremor had passed, or perhaps he had simply willed it away. He added the water drop by drop, watching the pigment swirl and darken. The pot hissed as the liquid met the heat, a sound like a held breath being released. Iris watched him, her expression unreadable. He did not need to see her face to know what she was thinking. She had made her opinion clear from the beginning. This was not alchemy, not in the way she understood it. It was something darker, something that required a different kind of precision, a different kind of sacrifice. He stirred the mixture, his movements slow and deliberate. The pot was warm beneath his hands, the heat seeping into his skin. He could feel the weight of the chamber around him, the way the stone pressed in from all sides, the way the air tasted of salt and copper and something older, something that had been here long before he arrived. The fire burned low, its light dimming as the last of the kelp was consumed. He adjusted the valves, feeding it more air, more fuel. The flames flared again, casting a flickering glow across the rows of pearls, across the sketches of Céleste's face, across the copper pot and the glass vials and the tools of his trade. He had built this place with his own hands, had lined the walls with stolen memories, had arranged the tools with ritualistic precision. He had done it all, knowing what it was, knowing what it would cost him. And yet, he had done it anyway. The pot bubbled, the liquid inside turning a deep, murky green. He leaned closer, inhaling the scent of salt and algae and something older, something that did not belong to the surface world. It smelled like the abyss, like the slow rot of things that had been forgotten. He reached for the vial of pearl powder, his fingers brushing the cool glass. The powder inside was fine and white, the essence of 100 stolen lives. He measured it carefully, his hands steady, his breath even. Iris did not speak as he added the powder to the pot. She simply watched, her gaze heavy with the weight of what they were doing. The mixture hissed as the pearl powder dissolved, the liquid turning a milky white. He stirred it slowly, watching the color deepen, watching the memories of the mermaids who had once carried those pearls dissolve into something new, an item native to that ancient Greek region. The man placed the utensil aside and cleaned his fingers against the kitchen cloth. The cloth had hardened from brine, its compartments laden with the burden of his shame. He had done this before, had ground memories into powder, had distilled lives into something that could be consumed. However, this situation proved unique. This was not just alchemy. This was theft. And he was the thief. The fire beneath the pot burned low, its light flickering against the chamber walls. The lustrous orbs shimmered beneath the muted radiance, their exteriors flawless and pristine. Céleste's portraits faded into darkness, her likeness dissolving as time marched forward. He extended his arm to retrieve the grinding bowl, palm making contact with its cracked surface. The memory of her hands on it was fading, replaced by the ghost of his own. He ground the last of the algae into powder, the sound sharp in the silence. Iris exhaled, a slow release of breath that carried the weight of her disapproval. She did not speak, but she did not need to. Her silence was enough. He added the powder to the pot, watching the liquid turn a deep, murky green. The scent of salt and algae filled the chamber, thick and heavy in the trapped air. The pot bubbled, the liquid inside turning a milky white. He gently swirled the mixture, observing as recollections faded away, observing as the histories of sea maidens who had previously possessed those luminous gems transformed into something entirely different, something that would belong to Thessaly. He set the spoon down and wiped his hands on his apron. The fabric was stiff with salt, the pockets heavy with the weight of his guilt. The fire burned low, its light flickering against the chamber walls. The nacre spheres caught the subdued illumination, displaying polished and perfect contours. The sketches of Céleste's face blurred in the shadows, her features slipping away with each passing day. He reached for the mortar again, his fingers brushing the chipped rim, and he began to grind. The water pressed against the chamber walls with a sound like slow, deliberate breathing. Blanc's fingers paused above the copper distilling coil, the metal still warm from the last reduction. He had been counting the condensation droplets when the door seal hissed open, an intrusion of pressure, a shift in the current that raised the fine hairs along his arms. She entered without announcement, her tail moving with the quiet efficiency of something built for deep water. The bioluminescence from her scales cast shifting patterns across the stone floor, blue-green reflections that danced like trapped fireflies. Blanc did not look up immediately. He finished counting the droplets, 23, 24, before setting down his stylus and turning. Iris. The name had been spoken in Thessaly's voice during their last audience, delivered as both command and concession. You will teach her. She will learn from you. No explanation, no negotiation, just the weight of the Queen's expectations settling between them like sediment. She carried herself with a precise economy of movement he recognized in himself. No wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish. Her silver-gray eyes found his immediately, holding his gaze with an intensity that suggested she had already measured him and found him wanting in some way he couldn't yet name. "You're late," he said, because the silence demanded breaking, and because he needed to establish the rhythm of their interaction before she could. A slight tilt of her head, the barest acknowledgement. The current near the eastern ridge was stronger than anticipated. Her voice carried the musical lilt of the deep merfolk, but her words were clipped, deliberate. She was choosing each one carefully, just as he was. Blanc gestured to the workspace. Thessaly didn't specify what you were meant to learn, only that you would. Iris moved forward, her tail leaving a faint trail of moisture on the stone. She examined the apparatus with the critical eye of someone who understood the mechanics of transformation. Her fingers hovered above the distilling coil, not quite touching. "You're refining memory," she observed. "Not just pearls, not just pigment." He should have been surprised that she recognized the process so quickly. Instead, he felt the first prickle of something dangerously close to admiration. "You've studied alchemy. Enough to know when someone is lying about its purpose." Her gaze flicked to the ledger where he recorded each batch's properties. "You're not making medicine. You're making something that consumes." The words settled between them, heavy with implication. Blanc found himself studying the way her scales caught the light, how the bioluminescence seemed to originate from within her rather than reflect it. There was a quality to her presence that made the chamber feel less like a prison and more like a crucible. She reached into the pouch at her waist and withdrew something small and round. "This is for you." The pearl rested in her palm, still warm from her body, radiating a heat that seemed impossible in the cold chamber. Blanc recognized the quality of it immediately. Iridescent, layered with the faintest blue undertone that spoke of deep water origins. A mermaid's pearl, not harvested, but given. "A test," she clarified before he could speak. "Not a gift." He understood. This was the first move in whatever game Thessaly had set between them. Offer something of value. See what the other does with it. Take or refuse. Keep or return. Respect boundaries or cross them. Blanc extended his hand. His fingers, calloused from grinding pigments and handling heated copper, trembled slightly as they closed around the pearl. The warmth seeped into his skin, spreading up his wrist like an accusation. When he looked up, Iris was watching him with an expression he couldn't decipher, though her eyes held something sharp and assessing. "You're wondering if I'll use it," he said. "Aren't you?" He turned the pearl in his fingers, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness, the way it seemed to pulse with its own inner light. "I'm wondering why you offered it." The current shifted in the chamber, carrying the scent of salt and something older, something that spoke of deep trenches and forgotten things. Iris's tail curled slightly, the movement subtle but deliberate. "Because Thessaly ordered me to learn from you, and I prefer to know who I'm learning from." Blanc placed the pearl on the workbench between them. The copper surface was cool beneath his fingertips, a counterpoint to the pearl's lingering warmth. "And if I tell you I'm exactly what you suspect? Then I'll know to be careful." Her voice was steady, but her fingers flexed at her sides, betraying the tension she otherwise concealed. He should have left it there, should have let the pearl sit between them like a challenge, like a boundary. Instead, he found himself saying, "Careful is wise, but it won't change what Thessaly wants from either of us." Iris's gaze flicked to the ledger again, to the sketches of chemical structures and memory pathways he'd been mapping. "You're trying to perfect something that shouldn't exist, and you're here to make sure I don't." It wasn't a question. She didn't answer. Instead, she reached out and touched the distilling coil, tracing the path of condensation with one finger. The movement was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with understanding. She was learning the shape of his work, the contours of his captivity. Blanc watched her fingers move along the copper, watched the way the light from her scales played across her skin. There was something hypnotic about the precision of her movements, something that made him think of the way he measured ingredients, the way he timed each reduction. She was studying him the way he studied compounds, looking for patterns, for weaknesses, for points of leverage. When she finally looked up, her eyes held a question she didn't voice. Blanc found himself answering it anyway. "It's not just about the pearls," he said. "It's about what they contain, what they remember." Iris's fingers stilled on the coil. "And what do you remember?" The question hung between them, heavy with implication. Blanc thought of Céleste's face, already fading at the edges of his memory. Thought of the way Thessaly's voice had sounded when she first described the Consommé's purpose. Thought of the ledger entries that grew more desperate with each passing day. "Enough to know I don't have a choice," he said. Iris's tail shifted, the movement sending ripples through the water. "Everyone has a choice. Not here." He gestured to the chamber walls, to the sealed door, to the apparatus that had become both his purpose and his prison. "Not when Thessaly decides what you're worth." For the first time, something flickered across Iris's face, something that might have been recognition, or pity, or the first stirrings of understanding. She withdrew her hand from the distilling coil and turned to face him fully. "Then we're both already lost," she said. Blanc picked up the pearl again, feeling its weight in his palm. It was still warm, still pulsing with whatever essence she had pressed into it. He thought about the ledger, about the next reduction, about the way Thessaly's voice had sounded when she gave her orders. "Maybe," he said. "But that doesn't mean we can't make it beautiful." Iris's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were trying to decide whether he was offering a promise or a threat. The current shifted again, carrying the sound of water lapping against the chamber walls, the only witness to their exchange. Blanc placed the pearl in the small ceramic dish he used for testing new ingredients. The dish was cool against his fingers, a counterpoint to the pearl's warmth. He reached for his stylus, ready to record the pearl's properties, its weight, its origin. When he looked up again, Iris was watching him with an intensity that made the chamber feel smaller, more intimate. The bioluminescence from her scales cast shifting patterns across her face, across the workbench, across the ledger where he would soon record her offering. "You'll use it," she said. It wasn't a question. Blanc remained silent. He didn't need to. The pearl sat between them, warm and waiting, and the current carried the weight of what came next. The pearl rolled into his palm like a drop of condensed moonlight. Blanc felt its warmth before he saw it, heat radiating from the curve of Iris's fingers, heat that should not have lingered in the chill of the sealed chamber. His breath stilled. The copper pot hissed on its tripod, steam curling into the dome of trapped air. But for a moment, the only sound was the soft click of the pearl settling against his skin. Iris did not withdraw her hand immediately. Her fingers hovered, just shy of touching his, as if she expected him to pull away. He did not. Instead, he turned his wrist slightly, letting the pearl rest in the hollow of his palm where the skin was thinnest, where the heat would seep into his bones. Her knuckles were sharp, the webbing between them faintly translucent in the glow of the bioluminescent algae that clung to the chamber walls. He traced the delicate veins with his gaze, memorizing the way they branched like cracks in ice. "For the consommé," she said, her voice softer than he had ever heard it. Not a command, not a challenge, an offering. Blanc smiled. It was the same smile he had given Thessaly when she first presented him with the task, the same smile he had practiced in the mirror of his rented room in Marseille before the Meridian set sail. A smile that promised cooperation, gratitude, even affection. A smile that did not reveal the calculations behind it. "Thank you," he said, and the words tasted like salt and copper, like the residue of the broth that perpetually simmered in the copper pot. He reached for his journal with his free hand, flipping to a blank page with the ease of long habit. The leather cover was worn smooth from use, the pages edged with the faintest yellow from the algae's light. He had sketched Iris before, her profile in three-quarter view, the angle of her jaw, the way her gills fluttered when she was agitated, but never from memory, always from observation, always from life. Now, he placed the pearl beside the most recent sketch, its luster dull in comparison to the living warmth of her skin. His fingers brushed the page, leaving a faint smear of salt where the pearl had rested. He uncapped his inkwell, dipped the nib, and wrote the date in the margin with precise, looping script. 12th of the black tide, year of the drowned moon. A human date, a human measure of time, meaningless in the depths where the currents stretched years into decades and decades into centuries, but necessary. He needed to mark the moment, to fix it in place. Iris leaned forward, her tail coiling beneath her as she peered at the journal. The movement sent a ripple through the water outside the chamber, a faint disturbance that made the algae's glow pulse in response. "You draw me," she said, and it was not a question. Blanc kept his gaze downward. "I document." A pause. The copper pot hissed again, louder this time, as if the broth inside had begun to boil in earnest. The scent of it filled the chamber, brine and something darker, something that smelled like the inside of a shell left too long in the sun. Iris's gills flared, just slightly, a sign of discomfort he had learned to recognize. She did not like the smell of the consommé. Neither did he, if he was honest with himself. But honesty was a luxury he could no longer afford. "You draw me," she repeated, and this time, there was an edge to her voice. Not anger, not yet, but something sharper. Something that cut through the thick air between them. Blanc set down his pen. The pearl sat on the page like an accusation, its warmth seeping into the paper, staining it with the ghost of her touch. He closed the journal with a soft thump, the sound muffled by the weight of the water pressing against the chamber's walls. When he finally met her gaze, his expression was carefully neutral. "I draw what I need to understand." Iris's eyes narrowed. They were the color of storm clouds over open water, shifting between gray and green depending on the light. Now they were dark, almost black. "And what do you need to understand about me?" Blanc did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached for the pearl, rolling it between his fingers. It was still warm, still hers. He could feel the heat of her in the curve of it, the way it fit against his skin as if it had been made for him. A perfect sphere, a perfect offering. "I need to understand how you give," he said at last, his voice low, "and what you take in return." Iris recoiled as if he had struck her. The movement was subtle, just a shift of her shoulders, a tightening of the muscles along her jaw. But it was enough. The water outside the chamber rippled again, this time with more force, as if something large had passed by in the depths. The algae's glow dimmed for a heartbeat, then flared back to life, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Blanc did not flinch. He had spent too many nights awake in this chamber, listening to the groans of the stone and the whispers of the current, to be unsettled by the dark. Instead, he tucked the pearl into the spine of his journal, where it would not be lost, where it would not be forgotten. Iris watched him, her breath coming in shallow, uneven pulls. The gills at her throat fluttered like the wings of a trapped bird. "You're not just documenting," she said. "You're collecting." Blanc said nothing. He did not need to. The journal lay open on the table between them, the sketch of her profile staring up at the ceiling like a silent witness. The date was written in his hand. The pearl was warm against his skin. Iris's fingers curled into fists at her sides. "I brought you a pearl," she said, her voice tight. "Not a piece of myself." Blanc closed the journal with finality. The sound echoed in the chamber, sharp and definitive. "Aren't they the same thing?" Silence. The copper pot hissed, steam rising in lazy spirals toward the dome of the ceiling. The algae pulsed, casting their eerie glow over the stone walls, over the table, over the two of them. Iris's tail flicked, sending a spray of water droplets into the air. They hung there for a moment, suspended, before falling back to the stone with soft pings. Blanc exhaled, slow and controlled. The tension in his shoulders eased, but the weight in his chest remained. He had not lied to her. Not exactly. He was documenting. He was collecting. But the line between observation and possession had always been thin, and he had long since crossed it. Iris's gaze dropped to the journal, to the sketch of her profile, to the date written in his careful hand. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "What happens when you've documented everything?" Blanc did not look at her. He did not need to. He already knew the answer. He would distill her, refine her, turn her into something useful. And then he would drink. The water in the chamber's crevice shivered. Iris's fingers, webbed and pale, plunged into the cold gap between two slabs of living stone. The current here was stronger, pulling at her wrist like an impatient child. Something brushed her knuckles. Paper, sodden but stubborn, wedged tight. She braced her other hand against the wall and tugged. The stone groaned, a low vibration that traveled up her arm, but the book didn't budge. She shifted her weight, pressing her hip against the slick rock, and pulled again. This time, the crevice exhaled, releasing its prize with a wet sigh. The sketchbook slapped into her palm, heavy with brine. Water dripped from its swollen spine, darkening the stone at her feet. She turned it over. The cover was leather, once rich and supple, now bloated and peeling. A single word had been scratched into the surface with something sharp. Céleste. Iris's breath stilled in her chest. She carried the book to the workbench, where the glow of Blanc's alchemical lanterns cast long, wavering shadows. The light here was warmer, tinged with the gold of pearls and the faint blue of memory. She set the sketchbook down and hesitated. Her fingers hovered over the cover, not quite touching. The leather was rough beneath her skin, the edges frayed where the salt had eaten at it. She could smell the sea in it, the deep, cold scent of places no merfolk ever went, places where the water turned black and the pressure crushed bone to powder. She opened it. The pages were thick, handmade, the kind humans used for things they didn't want to forget. The ink had bled in places, but the words were still legible, written in a looping, confident script. Céleste's handwriting. Iris had seen it before, in the margins of Blanc's notes, in the careful annotations he made when he thought no one was watching. But this was different. This was hers. Day 47. The pigment resists. It clings to the mortar like a living thing, refusing to break. I've tried heat, acid, even the old alchemical tricks. Nothing works. It's almost as if it knows what I'm trying to do. Iris traced the words with her fingertip. The ink was raised, the paper rough beneath her skin. She could almost feel the frustration in the strokes, the way the letters pressed harder into the page when Céleste had been angry. A sound made her look up. Blanc stood in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the dim light of the corridor beyond. He was holding a vial of something dark and shimmering, his fingers wrapped tight around the glass. His face was unreadable, but his knuckles were white. Iris didn't move. The sketchbook lay open between them, Céleste's words a silent accusation. Blanc's gaze dropped to the page. His expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted, like the moment before a storm breaks. He stepped forward, his boots silent on the damp stone. The lantern light caught the angles of his face, the sharp line of his jaw, the way his eyes darkened when he was thinking. "Where did you find that?" His voice was low, careful. Iris didn't answer. She turned the page instead. More notes. More frustration. More of Céleste's stubborn, relentless pursuit of something that wouldn't yield. And then, in the margin, in Blanc's precise, controlled script, impossible. Everything can be broken down. Iris's fingers tightened on the edge of the page. Blanc reached for the book. His hand was steady, but his fingers trembled when they brushed hers. She let him take it, let him turn the pages, let him see the words he had written in the margins of his lover's work. His breath hitched. Just once. Just enough for Iris to notice. She was wrong, he said quietly. About the pigment. About a lot of things. Iris looked at him. His face was smooth, his voice even, but his hands were shaking. The vial in his grip caught the light, throwing blue reflections across the stone. Was she? Iris asked. Blanc didn't answer. He closed the sketchbook with a soft thud and set it down on the workbench. The sound echoed in the chamber, bouncing off the walls, off the pearls strung like stars across the ceiling. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with something unspoken, something that hummed like the deep, slow pulse of the ocean. Then Blanc turned away. He walked to the far side of the chamber, where his alchemical apparatus waited, glass and metal gleaming in the dim light. He set the vial down with deliberate care, his back to her. Iris didn't follow. She stayed where she was, her fingers still resting on the sketchbook's cover. The leather was warm now, heated by the lanterns, by Blanc's touch, by the weight of what it contained. She opened it again. This time, she read the words aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. It resists extraction. An expectant hush descended upon the assembly. And then, from the shadows, Blanc spoke. So do I. The copper pot hissed where the fire kissed its belly, steam rising in slow, deliberate curls. Blanc stood before it, ladle in hand, the weight of the metal familiar now, almost an extension of his arm. The broth within shimmered, a living thing of shifting light, its surface broken only by the occasional bubble that burst with a whisper. He had learned to read its moods, the way it thickened when a memory took hold, the way it brightened when the essence settled true. Iris moved at the edge of his vision, her scales catching the firelight in flecks of silver. She did not speak, but her presence was a current in the water, pulling at him. He could feel her watching, always watching, as if she expected him to falter, as if she did not understand that faltering was no longer an option. He exhaled, slow and measured, and set the ladle down. The memory came unbidden, the exact shade of gold that had painted the Saône River at dusk, the way the light had fractured across the water like shattered glass. He could see it still, could almost taste the dry heat of the air, the way the river had smelled of silt and distant rain. But when he reached for the feeling of it, the warmth of the sun on his skin, the weight of his master's hand on his shoulder, there was nothing. Only the memory of the memory, hollow and distant, like a story he had been told but never lived. His grip strengthened on the serving spoon. He had to speak it aloud. That was the rule. The gold, he said, voice steady, was not yellow. Not truly. It was the color of old coins left in the sun, of honey held to the light. It caught the river in streaks, like someone had dragged a knife through butter. He paused, waiting for the familiar resistance, the way his chest would tighten, as if the words themselves were being pulled from him. But there was only the heat of the fire, the weight of Iris's gaze. The air smelled of warm stone and something green, something growing. My master's hand was heavy, not unkind, just certain. He lifted the ladle, let the words settle into the broth. The liquid trembled, then stilled, absorbing them like a sponge. A single bubble rose to the surface, burst with a soft pop. The broth brightened, just slightly, the way a pearl might if you turned it in the light. Iris shifted. He did not look at her. The ledger lay open on the workbench, its pages filled with his handwriting, neat, precise, each entry a record of what he had given. He dipped the quill, wrote the date, the memory, the time it had taken to distill. The ink bled into the paper, dark and permanent. He had not expected the forgetting. Not at first. The first memory had been easy. A childhood dinner, his mother's voice calling him in from the garden. He had spoken the words, watched them dissolve into the broth, and felt nothing but the satisfaction of a task well done. The second had been harder, the weight of his master's disappointment when he had failed his first true commission. The way the older man's voice had gone quiet, the way the silence had stretched between them like a wound. He had spoken it aloud, and the broth had taken it, and for a moment He had thought he might weep, but the feeling had passed, and the broth had grown clearer, and he had told himself it was worth it. Now, he could not remember what either of those memories had felt like. Not truly. He could recall the facts, the sound of his mother's voice, the weight of his master's hand. But the emotions were gone, leached away by the fire, by the broth, by the slow, deliberate work of extraction. He knew he had loved his mother. He knew his master had been disappointed. But the love, the disappointment, they were just words now, just entries in a ledger. He set the quill down. The fire crackled, hungry. Iris stepped closer. He could feel the heat of her, the way the water around her body seemed to hum. "Do you remember what they felt like?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of something unsaid. He did not turn. The ladle was warm in his hand, the broth within it still trembling. "Before," she clarified. "Before you put them in the pot." The question settled over him like a shroud. He wanted to lie. He wanted to tell her that of course he remembered, that the memories were still his, still whole, still real. But the words died on his tongue. He looked down at the broth. It was so clear now, so luminous, that it seemed to glow from within. He could see his reflection in its surface, distorted, fractured, but unmistakably him, or what was left of him. "I don't know," he said at last. The confession tasted like ash. "I remember the facts, the details, but the feeling." He trailed off, shook his head. "It's like trying to hold water in your hands. You can see it, but you can't keep it." Iris was silent for a long moment. Then, softly, "That's not how memory is supposed to work." He almost laughed. "No," he agreed. "It's not." The fire hissed, a living thing in the trapped air of the chamber. The broth shimmered, waiting. He lifted the ladle again. There were more memories to give, more clarity to buy. The goblet chimed against the obsidian armrest, a sound like ice fracturing beneath weight. Blanc's fingers tightened around the vial in his pocket, the glass warm as a living pulse. Thessaly reclined upon her coral throne, the blackened branches of it twisting upward like the ribs of some ancient leviathan. The great hall stretched around them, its arches lost in bioluminescent shadow, the walls slick with the residue of centuries, pearls embedded in stone, their luster dulled by time and the weight of what they had witnessed. She did not look at him as she lifted the goblet. The consommé swirled within it, luminous, viscous, catching the cold light of the hall like a captured star. Blanc had seen it 100 times before, but never like this. Never with the clarity of what it truly was. Thessaly drank. The broth slid down her throat, and for a moment, nothing changed. Then her shoulders stiffened. Her fingers, curled around the goblet's stem, whitened at the knuckles. The consommé did not merely enter her, it unfolded. Blanc saw it in the way her pupils dilated, the way her breath hitched, not in fear, but in recognition. The soup had taken effect. Fragments surfaced in the liquid's depths. A face, young, defiant, the jaw set in a way that spoke of a challenge issued and lost. Another, older, the eyes hollowed by something that was not death but worse, surrender. Thessaly's lips parted, and Blanc knew she was seeing them too, the ghosts of those she had broken. The broth revealed them, but not as they had been. As they were now, hollowed, extracted, their essence rendered into something consumable. Then the erasure began. The faces in the consommé did not fade. They thinned, like pigment washed from parchment, until only the barest impression of them remained. Thessaly's grip on the goblet loosened. Her scales, usually iridescent as oil on water, caught the light differently now. A faint translucency crept along her collarbone, her throat, the delicate webbing between her fingers. Blanc saw it, the hollowness settling into her like sediment, the way her desire for power, for dominion, for the weight of her own tyranny, was being drawn out of her, sip by sip. She exhaled, slow and deliberate, and the sound carried the weight of centuries. When she spoke, her voice was the same, commanding, unshaken, but her eyes betrayed her. They flickered, not with fear, but with the first stirrings of something worse, understanding. "You see it now," she said. Not a question. Blanc offered no response. He did not need to. The consommé had already spoken for him. Thessaly set the goblet down with a click. The liquid within it was no longer clear. It was clouded, as if something had been dissolved into it, something that had once been part of her. She did not look at him as she dismissed him, her fingers already tracing the translucent patches on her skin, as if she could memorize their edges. Blanc turned to leave, but not before he saw the way her gaze lingered on the goblet. Not with hunger, with calculation. She had been drinking the consommé for years. And now, at last, she understood what it was doing to her. The dying mermaid's fingers clawed at the stone slab, her nails scraping grooves into the wet surface. Water beaded on her skin, not from the sea, but from the slow unraveling of her body. Her gills fluttered once, twice, then stilled. Iris stood pressed against the chamber wall, her own breath shallow, her scales prickling with the wrongness of it. The air smelled of salt, and something sharper, like crushed pearls left to oxidize in the dark. Blanc moved with deliberate precision, his hands steady as he tilted the mermaid's chin toward the fire. The flames licked at the copper basin beneath her, their heat distorting the air above the broth. He murmured something, an incantation, a plea. Iris couldn't tell. And the mermaid's eyes, once the color of storm-washed kelp, clouded over. A thread of luminous blue seeped from her parted lips, twisting in the air like smoke before dissolving into the simmering liquid. Iris's stomach clenched. She had watched this before. She had even helped, once, holding a vial while Blanc coaxed the essence from a wounded soldier's last breath. But this was different. The mermaid wasn't already dead. She was dying, and Blanc was hurrying the process along, his fingers pressing just a little too hard against her throat. The broth in the basin shimmered, then darkened, absorbing the stolen memory. Blanc exhaled, slow and measured, and Iris mirrored the motion without thinking. The fire in the corner of the chamber burned brighter, as if sensing his satisfaction. Then his hand dipped into his coat. Iris's pulse hammered in her throat. No, not hammered, pressed, a steady weight against her skin. She told herself she was imagining things, but his fingers emerged holding a vial, small and stoppered with wax, and the label was unmistakable. Her name, written in his careful script. Her name. In his hand, the mermaid on the slab shuddered, her body convulsing once before going limp. The broth in the basin turned an unnatural shade of violet, thick with the weight of what had just been taken. Blanc didn't look at Iris. He never did, not during these moments. But she saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way his thumb brushed over the wax seal of the vial before tucking it back into his coat. The fire in the corner flared, heat licking at the edges of her vision. Iris's scales prickled, not from the warmth, but from the realization settling into her bones. This wasn't a mistake. The vial wasn't mislabeled. It was preparation. And she had just watched him make it. Act 2.